Welcome to the Empowering Women podcast. Together, we will hear from ambitious and inspiring career women as they share their stories of success and overcoming career challenges. And now, your host, Mel the Engineer.
Hello, and welcome to episode 3 of the Empowering Women podcast. I am your host, Mel the Engineer, and on this show, we speak with career women. Many of them have had unique successes in traditionally male-dominated fields, but I would say the common theme among them is work ethic and a desire to give back. We sincerely hope that you find the podcast helpful to your own aspirations, whether it's climbing a corporate ladder, starting a business, or just getting some inspiration. On today's episode, I am speaking with Jenny Han, a Chicago-based licensed architect at Skender. Jenny oversees the architectural and modular design practice. She has a strong interest in innovating and disrupting the design and construction industry through modular design and hopes that her team can solve the affordable housing crisis, improve wasteful design and construction processes, and make meaningful, positive social change. Part of what I speak with her about is her own volunteer work, and she definitely is making positive social change. So I think that's a great part of the interview that we get at towards the end. I do want to warn you that this episode is longer than usual. I hesitated to cut more from our conversation because I think Jenny has a unique perspective that's important to hear, both from the architecture construction space, but also regarding her experiences being a woman of color in this field. So I've put in several music breaks to give you sort of a natural pausing point where you can take a break along the way if you need to. At the end, I'll hop back on here with you to discuss show notes and other announcements from Empowering Women. And now I bring you Jenny Han. Jenny Han to the Empowering Women podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
As a professional architect, how would you describe yourself and your expertise?
That's an interesting question. So traditionally, as an architect, I have gone more the route of managing projects than being the creative mind behind design and aesthetic. I can comment on and critique and react to those kinds of things as an architect, but I think that my path definitely took me in the direction of more code compliance and all those super boring things that people in school don't realize architecture is about. But you can't have successful projects and design without understanding the movement and flow of people and protecting the welfare of the people going through the spaces. So as a licensed architect, that's my responsibility to society to make sure that what is being built is safe, code compliant, inclusive, and all those things that I think are actually very interesting in the intersection of aesthetic.
Okay, so we might have to come back to that topic. I think there's a lot that we could explore. It sounds like for architecture that's not covered in school, it's similar in engineering, I'm certain. Okay, so let's plow forward, and if we need to come back to that, we can. So what are your main responsibilities as Director of Design Operations at Skender?
So I have a twofold responsibility here. One of them is that I came in with my own book of business, or our studio came in with a lot of healthcare design and a little bit of commercial and hospitality, meaning restaurants and nightclubs and that kind of thing. But we already have clients that we work with our trade partners and other general contractors. And we continue to do that and provide good service for clients like DuPage Medical Group and Edward Elmhurst. So that's one side of what I focus on. And the other side is about our modular program. Skender had acquired our design team as well as Tim Swanson from Canon just about a year ago this Tuesday. It's our first year anniversary. And this was in with the effort or the goal of fully integrating between design, construction, and then the third arm is manufacturing. So we're building up a factory and we're able to design modular buildings and have them manufactured not so much as offsite building or prefab, which is more the trend and which has been the farthest developed of this new idea of how to deliver buildings. But we're taking it a step further and actually producing them on a factory line like cars or iPhones and that kind of thing. It's a very controversial topic amongst architects because they have this idea that we're taking all the creativity out of design, but what we're doing is we're modularizing the repetitive nature of design and allowing architects to really focus on the fun things that have to do more with aesthetic and facades and the ideal lobby spaces and those kinds of things that give the public, the general public and users the wow factor for what we do. Role is to help facilitate that growth and development and really understand what it means to work as a team without the separations and silos and contractual barriers that we typically have in the architectural and building worlds that have been plaguing us for, frankly, all of history. That, to me, is the operational side of what I do.
Fascinating. So you've got your hands in a couple of diverse areas, and it sounds like there's interesting movements in the architecture space in general in terms of changing in the years to come.
Yeah, I think that what we're doing is different for now, but we're hoping that it becomes more the norm in the near future in the years to come because there's a lot of things that are difficulties in the that are not necessary. And it's a big cultural shift that I believe that our industry is not only ripe for, but already starting to embrace and engage. We have several companies that are doing design build. Then the next step forward from that is fully integrated project delivery and then contractually having IFOAs, which is the integrated form of agreement where everybody has a stake in the game and everybody shares this with the profit. So no longer is there finger pointing, but people are trying to help solve problems together. And it really brings all the players to the table. And that's really, I think, what we're striving for. But what we at Skender are able to do is have everybody under the same umbrella. And so automatically we're working together as a team towards the same goal.
Okay, so I want to back up and talk about how you got to this place in your career. So I wonder if you might talk with us about why you decided to study architecture.
So this was the most interesting question that you had posed to me initially, and why I was initially hesitant to talk about my story, because it's not what everybody thinks an architect should feel and think about architecture. I came into this because it wasn't law and it wasn't medicine. And as a Korean American second generation kid in a very overachieving family, those were the only options. If I were to choose law or medicine, my parents would have understood, but I just was not interested in that. And I knew I had the foundations of something else that was more creative or might have led to architecture. I was sort of really interested in math and art and some level of creativity, but I really like to take things apart and put them together. And I think that's really what drew me and what, frankly, got me into school for architecture. So when I was applying to colleges, I said, well, if I get into Cornell, I'll become an architect. And lo and behold, I got into Cornell. And I, for 5 years, was wondering if I had made the right choice. And actually, until I was 30 years old, I wasn't sure still. But it was the time when I realized that I had to express myself through drawing. I had to explain something by drawing it that I thought maybe at 30 years old I had made the right decision as an 18-year-old kid.
So you mentioned that your parents would have understood if you chose to do law or medicine, and you made a different choice. Was that difficult for your interactions with them? How did that play out?
I think that because I had two older siblings, one that did medicine and one that did law, my family sort of checked those boxes. And so perhaps it was easier for me to do something different. I just knew in my heart of hearts that I wasn't going to like either one of those. And so I had to do something else. So even after getting into great school and studying there for 4 out of 5 years, at the end of my fourth year, my mom still said I had an opportunity to apply to medical school. And so I just knew that it wouldn't matter if she understood or not. I just had to continue on the path that made sense to me. So it was almost like, oh, that's nice, dear. You're an architect. One of these days you'll get married to a wealthy man and you won't have to worry about supporting yourself or something like that. I think that my path at that point was sort of just from the gut and from the heart. And I just kept on doing things, whether or not I knew if they were like the heart of my journey as an architect or not.
What did you find most difficult about navigating your early career, and how did you handle that?
Well, I think that I didn't have anybody in my life that was in an architectural field or was an engineer or who really understood what that meant. Early on in my career, I sought mentors. In my first job at Stanley Tigerman's office in 1994, I had two very talented managers, I suppose, who I reported to, who became my mentors. And that's the way that I was able to find people to help to explain what's going on or to model behavior for me or to help me when I was struggling. And my family's very supportive, but only to the extent that they can understand. So I had made a lot of decisions in my career that they simply just did not grasp, because who gets a contract when you go into business with someone? Because they seem to be trustworthy, and well, that's a whole other story we can go into later. But um, the early career piece, I think I answered that with finding mentors, and that was really what saved me.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that you're going to ask about going to school after that, so I didn't want to shoot too far into the future with the other things.
Let's go there now. So you decided to go back to graduate school. Tell us how you made that decision and what you studied then.
So when I went to Cornell for undergrad, the focus for that program was very, very design heavy. And for me, having sort of chosen that path by process of elimination, I felt that I had missed out on some other opportunities for learning things that I was passionate about, or I might not have been aware I was passionate about. I was just interested enough in some of these things that I didn't feel like I could explore, or I was not encouraged to explore during undergrad. In fact, I had taken a bunch of women's studies classes, but the program would not acknowledge that as a double major or a minor. So I felt a little bit disappointed by that. As an aside, in my tenure there for 5 years in the design studios, I was always the one who was focusing on the social aspect of architecture instead of the aesthetic side of architecture and what the building meant to the communities they were in or how they were going to be used by different types of groups of people. So I really wanted to look at the impact on different demographics or different individuals of architecture and space. My bachelor's thesis was actually a halfway house for women, and it was the study of power and voyeurism in architecture and space. And I used the panopticon, which is the way that traditional prisons were set up so that guards would have a 360 view of all the cells at one time, and it was a very disempowering spatial relationship with the prisoners because you had no privacy and you were always being looked at, and I just felt that that had an intersection with the way women are looked at. And then I studied that a lot of women who enter the prison system do so because of similar victimizations, that it's a very different cross section of society than the male population. Now, I mean, I'm sure there are plenty of women who commit crimes and so forth for the same reason as men, but it really was disheartening to study that a lot of it was because they had challenged their abusers and ended up, you know, causing them physical harm or even like killing them, but they finally freed themselves of one prison to enter another one. So anyway, the constant seeking of this social impact of space led me to go back to school. It was the University of Chicago Masters of the Arts program in Social Sciences, where there were a lot of interdisciplinary social science interests in one space, which was fascinating because I wanted to study low-income housing projects in Chicago and the use of space there. And then next to me was someone who was studying how people in geriatric communities respond to various social issues there, and there were history majors and so forth. So I was able to explore the intersection in a more specific way from a social aspect with more of a focus on the social piece. I was able to do an ethnography in the Robert Taylor homes before they were torn down. And I was fascinated to find, and I think fascinated is the wrong word because, I was embedded in the community there. And so I was actually providing childcare as a volunteer in one of the daycare centers that was at the base of one of the housing project buildings. And they accepted me as somebody who was part of their fabric, at least twice a week for a couple hours. And I was able to talk to people about how they navigate the space, and a lot of the presumptions that we make or that I made at the time, I just found to be wrong, that the social fabric in the housing projects was a lot stronger and more organized than you would think. I mean, there's gang activity and so forth because of the way that they had developed in time and history, but the two things that were the most feared by people who lived in the projects were the fighting dogs and the police, because they're both equally unpredictable and dangerous. That was an eye opener for me, and I wasn't sure how I was going to use that in my career, but I felt finally that I had satisfied this curiosity for the time being in taking my studies a certain way. And after that, I decided that I would return to architecture, but I would separate this sort of social interest to my extracurricular, not-for-profit activities. And so I ended up going the route of nightclubs and restaurants and condos, and then eventually healthcare, and then my job right now as a professional. But then I started to mentor high school immigrant girls, which I still do today, and serve on boards for social service organizations. And now I'm starting to see that come full circle.
Yes, it's amazing how those things in our professional life do come full circle. I want to ask you, so as part of this research, did you design a halfway house? Was that a component?
So for my bachelor's thesis, I did a study in my hometown of Cleveland, Ohio, and designed a building that was a halfway house for women that was part residential, and it was all about taking power over space, making space flexible, but also that is part of a larger program, because space and program were like inextricably related, and you need to have a program of empowerment if you're going to have spaces that are empowering. So it was a community center, and it was a job placement program and training for that kind of thing. But also, women who worked there could have families, and then they would live there and could work there at the same time. So earning a living wage while being surrounded by other people like them in the same community.
I feel like it's easy to grow up in the United States and kind of be surrounded by only one view. And I can remember when I studied abroad, I was in France, someone spoke with me about this alternative idea of helping people who are on welfare, basically, people who have fallen down on their luck for whatever reason and they needed support, and so they were getting government support. And the approach that was described to me was, we put these people in a really nice apartment unit, we give them a really nice view, because we believe that if we treat them well and help them get back up on their feet, they want to contribute to society. They're better themselves and happier if we do this for them and help them get back on their feet. And I encountered some similar ideas visiting Denmark as well. And so I wonder if you might comment on some of these, more progressive ways of thinking about what you called the social impact of space.
Well, I think that my view of it is slightly different. And I think this also stems from my ethnography and being embedded in a community, is that the assumption that people don't want to contribute to community because they're down on their luck is not the way I like to look at it. I think that these people who I encountered, they all wanted to contribute to the community, and they were very giving. And you'll find that statistically, people give more who have less.
Absolutely.
Ways, right?
Yeah. I just want to clarify. I don't mean they're the different ones. It's our approach as a society that we take that is maybe needs improvement.
No, absolutely. I think that what you were highlighting is the way that so many governments and also people who oppose these kinds of programs feel that, oh, these people are not deserving, and they are not part of our fabric and part of our community. But once we sort of let go of that, then we can look at things differently. Then sort of the dignity is given back to people. So a lot of times people fall on hard luck because they are working 2 or 3 jobs, but they have to make a decision between going to work and taking care of a sick child, and then they lose the job, and the only way that they can get support is to be on the welfare system. And these are the ones that are working the hardest. So my goal is to provide just housing, like just really good housing. And what we're doing now is that I mentioned is full circle, is that our goal is to create a way to just make affordable housing just housing. I mean, everything will be affordable. It's not just certain types of housing for certain people. And if we take away a lot of the waste and inefficiency of the way that we interact as our industry, the way that we build things, we're not looking at minimum standards here. We're making everything like the highest quality, the most non-combustible, the most durable for everybody. And so this translates to the Gold Coast, and it translates to Humboldt Park or Lawndale. It doesn't matter. It's all the same high quality because everybody's deserving of that. And so to be able to, say, buy a 3-flat and rent out 2 floors in your neighborhood where you are now, where you have community, that's the goal. And it doesn't change the way the building is built. So spatially, we're looking at best in class. And so you'll find that on a typical city lot in Chicago, there aren't very many variations of how to occupy that lot. You have the front is the front, the back is the back, the sides have the same restrictions and how far they need to be from other buildings and the amount of light and so forth. So if we just get the best layout and we build hundreds of them off the factory line, and we can then make decisions on how they're clad, or if we're going to use a laminate that's durable versus a marble. It doesn't really matter because the space is the best and the most efficient, and that way people can feel good, like you said, about having the nice view and having their own space and being in the fabric that they're used to being in, and with the community and support that they have always had, but they can feel some more dignity and in that way contributing to the community because now they are able to house other people in an affordable way.
You're listening to the Empowering Women podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today. So, Jenny, would you mind talking to us about what it means to become a licensed architect? And in particular, what does that mean to your career?
I think it's a very interesting topic because there are quite a small number of architects that actually get licensed. You can see in the history, you can look them all up, all the active numbers, and it only goes up into, I don't know, the 10,000s. I'm looking at my number right now, and it's I was a 20,000th something licensed architect in Illinois, and that's not a lot. I think that it's just so difficult to get licensed, which is for a good reason, because there was historically a lot of responsibility for the architect for life safety and making sure that things are built responsibly. The course of history for architectural careers has actually taken the master builder architect away from the center of the whole relationship construct for architecture and design and construction, and sort of put the owner and owner's reps and other engineers even closer to the center, and the role and importance of design has been compromised or downplayed or looked at differently in the course of history. So there's a lot of reasons I think that people choose not to get licensed. One of them is that you can go your entire career and do very well without having to stamp a drawing. So there's the licensure and legality and risk aspect that, if you are one of the few licensed architects in your firm that actually stamps drawings, you have to be covered by insurance for the company and so forth. And a lot of people think it's just too risky to go on their own and stamp drawings. So you can have a company with thousands of architects and only a small handful are licensed, which I think is a shame and unfortunate. The other reason why it's difficult and a lot of people choose not to do it is because there's so many steps to get there. So, and I'm not as knowledgeable about this as it is right now, but back when I was in school, it was just transitioning. The testing process was transitioning from a hand-drawn multiple choice all-day affair where you would take a series of 7 to 9 exams in a day or two consecutive. You would draw things by hand, and they would be pinned up and graded by judges, outside of the whole testing schedule. And then finally, they went to an electronic version. So when I finally got licensed, I had to take 9 exams, and 3 of them were some kind of
9
hodgepodge.
exams?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
It's no joke. And you had to both know, it's because architecture is so diverse in its knowledge base that you have to understand planning and site, and you have to know a little bit of everything. And throughout the years, it's been, I guess, difficult for them to figure out ways to really test that knowledge. So there's building science, so mechanical, electrical, plumbing, fire protection. We have engineers that do that, but we have to show that we know enough about it so that we can coordinate those sub-consultants. You have to show that you can do some planning. You can understand how to read a topography map and understand grading and so forth. And then you have to understand some of the legal aspects of it and the professional practice of it. So it's really burdensome. It's expensive. It's time consuming. And if you don't have to do it to have a good career, why would you do it? So I think it's unfortunate. I think everybody should endeavor to be licensed because the more people who are better, well-rounded, just the better the profession is in general. But I actually didn't get licensed until 2009. Wow, that seems so far ago and yet so recent. I graduated from college in 1994. Worked for 3.5 years, went back to school, took a little break and did some freelancing for a couple of years, and then went back into architecture. Had my own company with a partner, although I wasn't licensed, so I was really just an employee. And that was challenging and had its own diversions or distractions. So I started the process in 1999 and I finished 10 years later. And in the course of that, and since then, it's morphed from 9 exams to 7 exams, and I'm not sure where it is right now. But you also have to show that you have a certain number of hours of experience or a certain number of years in the field. So when you're taking these exams, you can study for about 50% of what's covered, and the other 50% is what you've experienced in the field. And it's sort of either a guessing game or a logic game, or it's something that you've actually hopefully experienced through the actual practice of architecture.
I wonder if you might go through with us a bit more of the timeline that you were just describing. So I'd like to hear about how your career progressed and like in terms of responsibility. So I didn't know that you had your own business with a partner for a period of time. So I wonder if you might walk us through some of how that unfolded.
So after I graduated from graduate school, incidentally, I am like many architects. I'm not super fond of a lot of reading and writing, and grad school was all about reading and writing. So I felt like I had to just take a break from that sort of rigorous intellectual schedule, I suppose. And so I decided to just work for Thornton Tomasetti back in the day when it was Thornton Tomasetti CBM before they became this world-renowned structural engineering company. And I drafted for them. And it was great. It was fantastic. It was fun. I got paid well, and it was the perfect break that I needed. So after that, I got pulled into the company where I was doing nightclubs, restaurants, and condos. And my role there was sort of running the office, producing the permit drawings, and actually running permits. I was at City Hall very consistently, and often people thought I was an expediter I was there so often. But that experience, it was great. I mean, it was a lot, running your own company and supervising people and that kind of thing. It was a small company, maybe a handful of people. In the end, I was sort of forced to do more than that. The client side, getting work, and also running the office was something that I hadn't anticipated, but I ended up having to do. And so when I left, it really put me in a position where my skill sets were heavily sought out. And when I was hired at the next job, Proteus Group, I was immediately catapulted into this project manager role, running their whole Rush University Medical Center's whole plan of correction program with CMS, which is a federal agency that oversees the sort of facility side code compliance. So it was a 10-year program, and I think that had I not been put into this role where I was doing a lot of different things and doing a ton of problem solving, I would never have had that opportunity. So my experience there for 13 years, I had no idea what I was doing, meaning, I mean, I knew what I was doing, but I didn't know how it fit into the larger realm of architectural hierarchy or roles and responsibilities. I was playing the role of architect, but also program manager, and basically representing the owner in these many code compliance and sort of high risk projects that were sort of campus wide. In some ways, they seemed kind of silly. I crawled into every air handler that served patient care units on the campus. My entire body was in these air handlers to make sure that there was no rust in the path of air, that kind of thing. But it was a lot of fun because there was something new around every corner, and my role was consistently changing. And then I realized in the end that this is not what all architects do, even on healthcare campuses. I think that, I had struggled a bit with some of these other roles that I played because they challenged me in ways that I wasn't sure that I could deliver. But, I just sort of kept my head down and tried. And I think that is the sort of theme for my career, and probably the one thing that I would hope that people can learn from somehow.
So, Jenny, you have made it up the ranks in your field in a very tangible and meaningful way. I wonder if you might discuss with us how you moved up from something like a managerial role to a director role, and what did it take? What did you learn along the way? And what would you recommend to other ambitious women who are looking to have some kind of success like this?
That's a great question. During my tenure at Proteus Group, we were essentially the in-house architects doing all the sort of facility renovations within the existing buildings. And like I said, whatever challenge or problem that was thrown at me, I just kind of said, okay, I'll give it a shot. And I started to take on responsibilities that required me to provide reports to the C-suite at the leadership at Rush, or to do sort of financial reporting for the group that we were in, or even if I wasn't asked to do it, I was curious to see how my projects were going, and so I just put together my own systems to analyze these things. And I was actually playing the role of more than just project manager without knowing it. And so I was very lucky to have a supervisor / boss at that location who understood and recognized that value. And I think that I was definitely nurtured in that way. And when he decided to retire, he asked me if I would be interested in taking his position, which was as principal in charge of that account on that site for all that staff. So I basically, in my mind, said, "Well, I'm already doing this, so why not just take the role?" There was a very tangible distinction between the role that I was playing before I took that title and after, and I didn't realize it until after it happened. That one day I walked into the office with this new title and feeling pretty good about myself, and all of a sudden feeling terrified that I was responsible for every action that our staff was taking on that campus. And then I also had to earn and maintain their respect and not let them see me sweat, that kind of thing. So it took a couple months maybe to get over that, and then it was just off to the races. And I think getting past this panic of, oh my gosh, I'm really in charge, and then just saying, oh, I've been already doing this. It was kind of out of order, but it was good enough to sort of get my feet solidly on the ground. But I did learn, I learned a ton. I learned that you have to treat people with dignity and respect. You have to be able to take the bullet for whoever you're working with, because out of dignity and respect, everybody stumbles and nothing is a challenge that you can't overcome for the most part. And I guess I learned that, it's not insurmountable. If the guy over there can do it, I can do it. A lot of times I'll think of things that way when I'm pushed into a situation where I feel overwhelmed. I realize that there are many people who are less capable than me playing the roles of positions higher than me. Then I shouldn't worry about things so much. And if I take pride in what I do, then that's the best I can do. And the best is good enough. And that's what I tell people too, especially the girls that I mentor for. That's good enough. And suddenly they realize that actually sometimes people don't ever realize that, which is a sad thing. And sometimes, and I have to admit that I test myself all the time. I don't think there's anybody that is fully confident unless they're just pretending or actually ignorant to their own feelings.
Skender was recently recognized as a most innovative company by Fast Company, which is awesome. So could you tell us about that? What makes Skender innovative and differentiated in the marketplace?
So I actually met Mark Skender years ago socially. I had somebody I worked with at Rush who was insistent that I need to get out and engage with our industry. So I met him early on and kept on getting these different messages from random people in my life about, oh, Skender's different, and we really like the way they do things. In fact, I was headed home to a reunion in Cleveland with an old field hockey teammate of mine from way back when, and she was working for a not-for-profit that delivered healthcare in low-income communities, and she randomly just said, "Have you ever heard of Skender?" And I said, "Well, yes, but why are you asking me that?" And she just was singing their praises, and I just thought that was very interesting, and it stuck in my mind. So years later, I asked Mark, before this whole endeavor that I'm in now, what makes Skender so different? And I actually honestly don't remember his answer, but now I know they have fully embraced this culture, lean culture, that at its core is about respect and trust. And I really have learned that they honor that in everything they do in every layer. As an architect coming into this space, never having worked for a large company, I'd never been onboarded before, and there was so much time and attention and respect paid to the process of getting people to understand what the values of the culture here are about and making them feel comfortable as part of a larger system. So I think that culture and those priorities make it possible for a company like this to have the courage to take a real big step in what they also believe in, which is removing inefficiencies from the way we do things and finding the right people to be part of that journey. And so I know that the reason why we got that award is because of our modular program. And what's interesting is that we got it in the field of architecture, and our architectural arm is not even a year old. And we got this amazing accolade, but it's really because together with construction and manufacturing, we're doing something that is not really done. And the reason why it's in the architecture category is also because there's not a category for manufacturing and construction. So it's very refreshing to be part of this. So it's essentially a startup, a lean startup within an established company, sort of a soft landing with all the support mechanisms already in place. It's a fun and messy and exciting process, and we have the right sort of support that's been established over many years to be encouraged to do this.
I don't typically hear about the intersection of architecture and manufacturing. Is there anything you can tell us about that or explain? So somebody who's not in this space at all, what does that mean and what does it look like in terms of what you're creating at Skender?
Yeah, I think that it's interesting to me the way the term architecture is used anyway in all sorts of industries. It really kind of has bothered me when Silicon Valley sort of usurped the term architect for their purposes with software development and so forth. But
I am with you there. I just want to say that.
Engineering, too, is the same way. But I think that the way that we're doing design, and I think I would use the term design more than architecture in this sense, is twofold. One, we're creating buildings, which is sort of traditionally architectural design. We're looking at aesthetically making them beautiful and relevant and modern or whatever is needed contextually for the different sites that we're looking at. But on the flip side of that, manufacturing always has design incorporated into it. If you think about manufacturing in sort of the lean vocabulary, the Toyota way is what lean is all about, with continuous improvement and removing waste and so forth. But that's based on building cars. So the car industry we see design all the time. We see at the auto show these futuristic cars, and that takes a lot of design. It takes a ton of design to build a car. Same way that Apple has designers working on the iPhone, and it looks different, version 1, 2, 10, 20, or whatever. And that's all about design. So this idea that we're designing for manufacturing of buildings is just another layer onto what manufacturing is already doing. But we just sort of have to shift our mentality around what design means. So design for buildings equals architecture. That's what we're doing.
Love that. Thank you for explaining that. And I will include some links in the show notes for our listeners about lean manufacturing and what you mentioned, sort of the Toyota way. It's interesting concepts anyway.
It's something that can be applied to anything and everything. And I just actually moderated a discussion, an event a couple of days ago which was a collaboration between the American Institute of Architects and the Lean Construction Institute that focused on what ways the lean process and lean culture can impact design in a positive way. And it's interesting to me that lean and the Toyota way is really considered the most beneficial for production. So it's a logical progression that construction is the one to embrace it first, and especially the trade partners, meaning the guys two away from the general contractor who are doing the electrical, the plumbing, and fire protection and that kind of thing. They're the ones who benefit the most because their voices are the least heard in the normal process of construction. So they're the ones who benefit from the most, and I think embrace it the most, because finally their thoughts on how to improve processes are heard, and actually that is beneficial across the board. But design is a little bit less linear. In fact, construction is more of a linear process, but design is more of a squiggle. It goes all sorts of different directions and then ends up in a line. So I think that the design community has its own misgivings about trying to see things in a more rational, logical, problem-solving kind of way, because they feel, and I mean, I feel also that the process is messier, and if you try to put it into a scientific equation, it just doesn't work. So I know that the design community has been a lot more reticent about embracing lean culture and this sort of design for manufacturing, but we're seeing that those are just myths, and having these trade partners' voices heard earlier in the process. I mean, they're the parallel to engineers for you. So if you are able to speak directly to the people who are building what you're doing, how much better can what you're designing be? It's like, suddenly then we don't have to worry about, oh, how much is this cool, awesome, beautiful thing that I'm designing going to cost? And going into sending these out for construction, that the owner can definitely afford this amazing thing that you designed, instead of crossing your fingers and saying, I hope that they don't value engineer out all the cool things in this project. And by the way, I have no fee to even be part of that conversation because my value has been diminished and you don't care about my profit. So I'm going to just wash my hands of it and then hope when I show up to the opening day that it looks something like what I designed. I mean, that's all that is really absurd. But I think that we're in these positions where we're just so far separated from the people who can actually help us realize the concepts and ideals that we're really holding ourselves strong to.
We're kind of long on time here, and I want to make sure we get to some other topics that are important for both of us, I think. So I'd like to ask you, you are involved with several different organizations and initiatives outside of work. You've mentioned a couple of them. I wonder if you would talk with us a little bit about the Chinese Mutual Aid Association and the Young Woman Warriors Mentor Program.
Sure. I'd be happy to. In the late 90s, I was invited to participate in a mentoring program called the Young Women Warriors. And at that time, I was sort of looking for some way to contribute to my community. So that I thought was perfect. When I was doing all my studies in undergrad, the one thing that kept on bubbling up was that mentorship was the single grassroots kind of effort that you can spend time on that is actually effective. So it's been 20 years since I've been doing this very same program, and all the people that are in the program right now were not even born when I started. So that's kind of mind blowing in some ways. But obviously, it's gratifying to be part of a group that really does make an impact on our immigrant youth. So the ladies that are a part of this program are typically immigrant first generation or second generation youth in the north side of Chicago, but they are also from all countries in the world. A lot of them are from Southeast Asia and some from Northern Africa and also in Central America. So it's a very interesting cross section, but it's really filling in that gap that I felt I would have loved to have, even as someone who grew up in the suburbs of Cleveland. That as a teenage girl in the U.S. who wants to talk to their mom about stuff, unless you really have a special relationship. And I had that sort of cultural gap and generational gap. And so a lot of these parents are working 3-4 jobs, or these kids are latchkey kids. And it's sort of a safety net for them to come to people when they have challenges, like normal teenage challenges, or also they have greater responsibilities, particularly because of language, where in 4th, 5th grade, they're translating health care documents or billing or banking legal documents for their parents is a lot of pressure. So our goal is to alleviate some of that pressure and be a resource. So it's really grown generationally, where the original generations of mentees have come back to mentor, and that's really fulfilling for me. After volunteering for about 7 years, I was asked to join the board, which I am now president of, and we're seeing a lot of amazing growth. And all I was interested in what really was the mentor program when I joined the board, but then I realized how many amazing things they did for all immigrant communities, again, from all over the world. But in many ways, they have services for the older generations. They have citizenship, job placement, English as a second language, classes. And so it's really, they're a leader for that kind of effort in Chicago and for the state. So that's an exciting thing to be a part of. I also am on a board called the Hanul Family Alliance. So that's taking myself back to the Korean side of me, because the Chinese Mutual Aid Association is like a lot of different organizations. It was founded by Chinese nationals from Vietnam, but now we serve everybody, like I said, from all different places in the world, except for Koreans are more focused with a couple of other agencies. So that was my way of sort of getting back to my own roots. And they also serve the elderly in our community. And they do home care services, so providing non-nursing home care in the language and culture that is comfortable for the clients. So those are things that I've done to sort of satisfy my social responsibility. I need to be engaged with that kind of activity. And one of the things that has been nice is that now I'm doing senior housing, which is a cross section between healthcare with memory care and assisted living, and sort of this. So it's a cross section between healthcare and residential, and there's an affordable aspect of that too. So another way that I'm coming full circle.
Thank you for describing those for us. You're doing a lot, and it's really amazing to hear about. So I'd like to shift gears a little bit and talk with you about your experiences as a woman of color in this space. So I'm actually not familiar with sort of the gender ratios in the architecture and construction space. So would you tell us about your experience?
I think that experience starts in college, and what I realized when I witnessed in school and back in the early 90s was that coming into school, we had about a 50-50 ratio of women to men. And within that, I can't even venture to guess how many were women of color, but it was a pretty significant, maybe a little less than half women of color of the women. But in our graduating class, I think that the percentage of women went down to like under 30 or maybe even under 25%. And so our industry for architecture is just not very supportive of women. There were not a lot of role models for us back then. I think there are a lot more now and a lot more who are women of color now, but I think that is still low. And we know as a STEM career that we need to work on pipeline. We need to bust some of these myths that women are not sort of capable or talented to do these kinds of careers, because in my experience women are the rock stars in the meetings that I'm in, or on the different teams that I've participated in. Those are the doers. It's been really important to me to, whenever invited to talk about things like this or to volunteer with the Girl Scouts, to show them just a different face, that maybe it inspires some Asian girl or another girl of color that, hey, it's not just a bunch of dudes with white hair that are practicing architecture. That's really critical, I think, to making sure that people who have talent and who are interested don't get discouraged because they don't see us out there. Perhaps after this conversation, we can take a look at some of those statistics and provide those for your audience.
Yeah, I would love to include those in the show notes. What do you think are the most important things to focus on as a leader when you're working towards cultivating a diverse team?
I think it's actually pretty simple. The way that people tend to fill positions is by asking their network or looking into people they already know. I actually experienced this because when I was in college, I founded a group called the Women of Color in Architecture, Art, and Planning. And I'm still friends with a lot of these people today, and they're doing amazing things. But we asked to be part of the recruitment process because we wanted to see how we can get more people who look like us to be doing anything in the program. And we sat there, and it was so the people that were in charge of looking for professors and visiting professors to participate in the teaching staff there basically said, oh, well, I asked my buddy if he had somebody he thought would be good for this position, or I went to, my fraternity and found some people who were interested in being architectural professors. And we just stood there and with our jaws on the ground and said, look, there's resources. There's other places you can look to see if you can get some good candidates. See that you can get some good candidates outside of just your buddies. And I think that that's important. We make an effort here to stay in touch with our friends from INOMA, which is the Illinois chapter of NOMA, which is the National Organization of Minority Architects. We stay connected with other organizations, professional organizations who have other resources and other networks. And we don't limit ourselves to the typical stock of people. And we have a very amazing team here, very talented, and who all have who are a very vibrant part of this culture that we need to have in order to be innovative and respect many different ways of looking at design and architecture. So it's not as hard as you would think.
Are there any experiences that you have had as a woman of color in this profession that you would like to discuss? Maybe something that, good or bad, something you had to perhaps overcome, or something where you got extraordinary support?
I think that my experience as an Asian woman in this space, I think as a woman in this space first, being at Rush actually was very refreshing to me because I was playing the role not only as architect, but also representing the owner. So people had to stay in line because I was their client. So I felt that I had a unique space that I was in where I could freely lead. And I didn't have to worry as much about perception of me. And I'm a very direct person. That's my style. And sometimes people don't appreciate that. But above all, I prided myself in being fair. And I think that all it took was for people to realize that I cared about I've cared about the client, but I also cared about getting the right people in the room to contribute to the solution. So if I was doing a sprinkler retrofit project, I'm going to have the sprinkler sub-consultant there, but I'm also going to have the guy who is actually cutting the pipe in the room to tell me what he needs from me to make sure that he could do his job right. And very quickly, it was a seamless process. This is a hard question to answer, actually.
I think what I want is just to open it up to whatever you might want to share. If there's something that you've experienced that you think would be important for an audience of women to hear that might help them, that you are comfortable with, then I want to make the space for that.
Okay, well, I really believe that you can overanalyze any situation. I can walk into a room and say, these people are going to see me as a woman. These people are going to see me as an Asian. They're going to expect me to be meek and mild and not be able to make decisions and not be able to lead the team. If I thought about all the circumstances where that was probably the case and it was probably true, then I would have paralyzed myself. So I would enter those situations and say, I'm just going to do the best damn job that I could do. And if people couldn't deal with it, or if my identity was getting in the way for them, then that's unprofessional, and they just could not survive on the team that way. I think that probably more out of anxiety about delivering the best job that I could do, or doing the best job that I could do, what overrode these ideas that I was going to be misperceived because of my identity. But at a young age, I did a lot of things to rebel against what I thought people would expect of me. And so I was sort of always loud when people thought I was supposed to be quiet. I you know, I shaved my head because when I was a teenager, because that just was not expected of an Asian girl. I swore a lot. I kind of had fun with that. And I wouldn't recommend it for every environment, but I think I got that out of my system somewhat, as a punk rock girl and goth at some point, and I explored all sorts of ways of expressing myself because I wanted people to know you can't just assume something about me because it's likely untrue. So I feel lucky that somehow I was able to get through that. And I think it's also kind of sad that I, walk into a room and I don't sort of recognize me being an Asian woman leader necessarily. I'm just a leader. And that's bittersweet in some ways, but it is important to me to lead and not say no, even if it's something that I'm fearful of. And this is also another way I internalize things, and I think that it's both negative and positive. If somebody else has faith that I could do something, then I give it a shot. It's not necessarily coming from me saying, "Oh, I could do that, no problem," but I rely on other people's confidence in me over my own, and that's not necessarily a good thing, but that has enabled me to do things that I don't think that I would normally volunteer myself for, like this podcast.
Okay, I want to ask you now about golf. So you are very passionate about golf and its importance as a businesswoman. Tell us about that and your thoughts around that.
So my journey into the golfing world actually was not that. It started out because my parents, when they retired to a golf course in Florida, and I would dread having to go down there and play and pretend to play golf. I would get so bored after the 13th hole that you just find me at the bar, which created other problems with my parents. But then I married my husband, who is a very avid golfer and very talented. And so that was one of the ways that he and my parents connected. So suddenly I had two reasons to play golf. And then when I was elevated to principal, when I was at Proteus Group at Rush, I suddenly had to host foursomes at their golf outing. And so I said, look, if there's three reasons to do anything, I always say you should do it. And so what I decided to do was, in order to make that more palatable, I sought out women to play in this first foursome with me as a principal. And I realized that it was a heck of a lot of fun to play golf with women. It's a completely different mindset for a total beginner arc golfer to play with people you're comfortable with. And ultimately, forget about all the business and relationships and all that stuff. If it's not fun, it's not worth doing. So let's make it fun. What I started to realize in that first year is that when I asked women in the profession who are leaders, sometimes COOs of hospitals or CEOs of their own company, when I asked them if they golfed, 9 times out of 10, they would say no. And I would ask why. And they said either they were embarrassed or they're terrible or, they just didn't want to be put in like an awkward situation with men in their industry. And so I decided after a couple of years of collecting pretty much like hundreds of names of women who answered that way in our industry that I was going to collect them and start having group lessons and get them out on the golf course, because saying no to that foursome where you're the client, and having you join a foursome is like the best thing that could happen to these people who are asking you, instead of getting in your head about just, I'm going to be embarrassed. It doesn't really matter. I also discovered that most men that I play with are terrible anyways, and they don't care. They just show up. So I think that the overriding theme more with golf for me is like anything in your career, just show up. Don't be so paralyzed and afraid that you don't even show up to your seat at the table.
That was a really excellent explanation. Thank you. And I'll just I'll add that I've seen the same thing as I've been out golfing. The men that I've played golf with, most of them are usually not good. It's more about the social interaction and as you're saying, the business interaction and making business happen in that setting. So it is important. And thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate it. Jenny, thank you so much for sharing this time with us today. Do you have any advice that you would like to share for women who are in architecture or similar fields that are looking to move up in the ranks?
I think that what's worked for me is not rocket science. It's to show up and not say no. For me, I rarely volunteer and seek out opportunity. That's certainly a way to do things and to sort of prescribe your own path. But that's not sort of my style. If somebody asks me to do something, like I said, I have faith that that person is asking me because they think that I could do it. And so just give it a shot. And secondly, to find mentors in all aspects of your life that sort of fulfill different roles and different needs that you might have. I have mentors personally and professionally, and I also I think that I learn as much from having mentors as from being a mentor, and that's something that is not sort of logical. I think in some ways that people think, oh, I just have things to learn from other people. But if you go out and be part of helping and leading other people, that sort of gives you the confidence and reiterates the things that you need to work on. But for me, even the thing that I actually really wanted to get out of giving advice is actually to 18-year-old high school girls who have so much pressure to pick the exact perfect career at the age of 18. I think that's the most absurd thing about our education system, that at that time in your life, you're supposed to know what you're going to want to do for the next 40, 50 years. And so for me, I just picked something and I just went with it, and I made sure that I was gainfully employed, but your career can take a very circuitous path and you can end up doing something completely different than what you imagined. But it's okay, because every step that you take informs the next one. You just have to not be paralyzed. So finding mentors and sort of taking a leap of faith really prevents you from stopping dead in your tracks and not trying.
Well said. Thank you, Jenny, so much for joining us today on the Empowering Women podcast. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me.
Dear listener, thank you again for joining us today. We greatly appreciate you downloading and listening to the Empowering Women podcast. If you'd like to take a look at the show notes, head on over to empoweringwomenpodcast.com. For this episode's notes, I've included links to the organizations and companies Jenny Hahn discussed, and we've also included references for some of the concepts she mentioned, such as lean manufacturing. I am a partner of the Empowering Women in Industry organization, which is hosting a conference in Chicago on September 26, 2019. This will be a powerful one-day event featuring topics to help you achieve your professional ambitions. I'll be there and would love to see you, so check out the details at empoweringwomeninindustry.com and come on out. It would mean a tremendous amount to me if you could go to iTunes and leave the show an honest, positive review. Good reviews help others to find the podcast, and this helps ensure we can continue producing career impactful and inspiring content. If you have ideas for our show, perhaps you'd like to recommend an inspiring woman to be our guest, please let us know. You can reach me directly on Facebook, Twitter, or email under the name Mel the Engineer. So on Facebook and Twitter, I'm on there as @MelTheEngineer, or you can email me at meltheengineer@gmail.com. Thank you again for listening, and until next time.
Thank you for joining us for an episode of the Empowering Women podcast with Mel the Engineer. If you find the Empowering Women podcast helpful, please consider leaving a review on iTunes or wherever you download your podcasts. Our show is a partnership between Mel the Engineer and the Empowering Women in Industry organization. Learn more by visiting empoweringwomenpodcast.com.